So Christmas in 2 weeks. Now, if you think about it, Christmas is probably the most familiar holiday in the West. Outshines pretty much everything else, and obviously it's far outstripped its spiritual and religious inception, and it's become secularized, which obviously branches it out into more areas. But it's still the most familiar and probably the biggest holiday of the year in the West. And for all of that, what do we really know about Christmas? What do we really know about that first Christmas? What do we really know about what started all of this? You know, the fascinating thing is that Christmas was not even celebrated in the early church for centuries. In fact, it was looked down upon. Could you cue the rain, please? It was looked down upon by the early church because celebrating the birthdays of martyrs, as they understood it, was a pagan practice. It wasn't a practice that they saw in Judaism as being approved. And so for Judaism and then moving out into the Gentile world as Christianity spread, it was the death day that they saw as the martyr's true birthday. And so we don't have Christmas being celebrated until about the 4th century, at least, when it was put in place by Constantine. But it was put in place to overlap and to superimpose on top of the Roman pagan holidays that were already there. And so Christmas was put on January 25th because that was the feast day of Sol Invictus. That was the unconquerable sun. And also during the week of Saturnalia, which was another Roman holiday. And it really didn't take any kind of hold until the 9th century, when Christmas, as we started to understand it, had its own liturgical base and had its practice. And so it was a slow train coming for Christmas. It was Easter that was the primary. Easter and Epiphany, believe it or not, were the primary early holidays of the church. They saw those as primary. And Christmas was coming later. And if we look scripturally, what information do we have? And there's so little there if you think about it. There's only 2 Gospels that have anything about birth narrative, and that's Matthew 2. And in Matthew 2, there's no story about Jesus' birth at all. All you get is the story of the Magi, which is a great story, but it comes later after Jesus' birth. And then in Luke 2, we have the actual birth narrative, the only birth narrative we have in the entire canonical Gospels. And we have the story of the shepherds and so on and so forth. In fact, let's read Luke 2, 1 through 7, and just get some grounding here on what it is that we really know about Christmas. Now, in those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that a census be taken of all the inhabited earth. And of course, for the Romans, that meant all of their territory, right? All the inhabited earth. This was the first census taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. And everyone was on his way to register for the census, each to his own city. Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the city of Nazareth to Judea, the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and family of David, in order to register along with Mary, who was engaged to him and was with child. And while they were there, the days were completed for her to give birth. And she gave birth to her firstborn son, and she wrapped him in cloths and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn. And then as you continue on, verses 8 through 26 give us a story of the shepherds and what happened there. So there you have it. How many lines is that? A dozen? So few details. So little that we really know about Christmas, and yet we've made a whole industry of it. We've got the manger scenes over there. And yet, what do we really know? We know that he was wrapped in cloths, and that's important, cloths, not clothes, but cloths, lying in a manger because there was no room at the inn. That's what we know, those 3 little bits. And then, of course, the shepherds give us more. But in any good story, the details are critical. It's so important to look at the details because they're never there randomly. And especially in a story that is so short. Man, if you're not going to have a lot of words, then every detail better be there for a purpose. And if the story is good, it is. There's always a purpose for each detail, showing something that's important for us to see, something that we really need to pay attention to. Now, if you think about it, we live our lives detail by detail, right? Tree by tree. We don't live the forest. That's only when we pull back in our minds that we can see the forest, but we live detail by detail. In fact, we prove authenticity with detail, don't we? When we hear a story, it's the details that give it the weight, that give it the authenticity. In fact, we prove our identity with details, don't we? The tiniest detail that nobody would ever know. Whenever you have to do those security questions, what are they going to ask you? It's going to be, who was your third grade teacher? What was the name of your first? They're getting really creative lately. And some of the, I can't even think of them now, but some of the questions that is being asked is like, wow, someone's really thinking about this. This is something that no one would ever know, right? Detail by detail, proving our authenticity. Yeah, I can tell you that I spent one fall, at least a trip during the fall in Boston. And I can tell you that, and I can tell you what I did and everything, and that would be a story. And you would know that I was in Boston in the fall. But if I start telling you details, if I tell you the quality of the air, the quality of the light as it came down at an angle, if I talk to you about the chillness that was in the air and how everyone was so formal as they dressed, you know, men and women walking the streets downtown with their top coats on and the scarves around their necks. To me, it looked so Dickensian, the kid from California, you know, to see that. And to just walk a few blocks and you'd be in these beautiful old brownstone walk-ups, you know, and then a few blocks later you're in a commercial district with all these mom and pop stores, and then there's gleaming high-rises, the John Hancock building, and a little bit further you're down in Faneuil Hall, and I got the best oyster stew I've ever had in my life. It was a religious experience that I've never been able to repeat. See, now you know I was really there. Now you know something about the authenticity of that trip. And so when you see just so few details here, what are they telling us? Why are they there? What's important about it? And really, if you take them as a whole and you know something, of course, about the culture and the history, then you know that Jesus' birth was ordinary. It was absolutely unremarkable. Even though the reaction of some was not, the birth itself was unremarkable. Let's take a look at those three little bits that we get. Cloths. They wrapped him in cloths, in swaddling bands, right? So when a baby was born in the first century, of course, they didn't have hospitals. It was just all midwifery there, right? And so the baby would come out, they would cut the cord, they would wash the baby, and they would rub the baby with salt. You know, they didn't understand about antibiotics at that point, but somehow they knew salt healed wounds and salt was good. So they'd rub the baby with salt and then wrap the baby tightly in bands, just cloth bands, just stuff that they had left over. It wasn't actual clothing as we would think of it. They just wrapped the baby really tightly in these pieces. So it was more like a mummy, or more like a burrito, I suppose, than it was actually putting the baby. But you know, we do the same thing here. Wrapping the baby tightly gives it a sense of security after coming out of the womb, right, where it's always being held tightly. And so wrap the baby tightly. And this is normal treatment. This is exactly what happened all the time. And so we see the same thing being echoed here in Jesus' birth. And now there's this business of lying him in a manger for a crib. The manger in Aramaic, Uriah, is the word. And basically these were found in every single house. Every single house had to have an Uriah. And they were either made of stone or they were made of mud or they were made of brick, but it was a block that was hollowed out on the top side. And it was used as a feeding trough for the animals. But every single house had one of these. And why was that? Because every single house lived on its livestock. The livestock was an integral part of their lives. And if the house was very poor, they still had their Uriah kind of mixed into their living space. And if the house was more affluent, then they would have separate floors, the bottom floor being the floor for the greetings and certain parts of their lives. And then, of course, there was a part for cooking, and there was a part for the livestock, and so on and so forth. But every house had this manger, this Uriah. And, of course, you think about it, here's this hollowed-out space, and it's lined with hay or feed or whatever, so it's a natural crib. But why did Jesus have to end up in the Uriah? Why didn't he get a real crib? Why wasn't he with the rest of the people? Because now we got to get to the inn. And that's such a bad word for us to translate this word as inn, because in Aramaic is khan. Khan is the way it's usually transliterated. But a khan is something very different than what we think of as an inn. A khan would be more like a truck stop. So when you go over the grapevine and the first thing you hit is a Flying J truck stop, this big sprawling space. And what has it got? It's got a restaurant there. It's got a place to refuel, and you can wash the trucks. You can take a shower. You can do whatever you need to do when you're on a long haul. Well, the caravan routes were the same way. And so these khans would be spaced out at strategic points along the caravan routes for the caravans to be able to come in and get refreshment and get cleaned up and so on and so forth. So that was the idea of an inn, but it wasn't like your Motel 6 or 8 or whatever they're up to now, even though they charge you $150 a night, right? So that's the idea of an inn. Very different than the word that is used here. The word that is used here is shirah. Shirah means a living space. So here's the thing. If you were very poor, your house consisted of one room, and it was a dirt floor. That's all you had. But what you did was you created a living space within that one room. And part of the space, maybe a corner or half of it, was a raised platform would be built, kind of like the one I'm sitting on right now. A raised platform would be built, and that was your living space. So that's where the actual sleeping went on, and the eating and so on and so forth. And over the dirt floor is where you cooked, and it's where all the animals hung out. Now, the animals would be outside during the day, but at night, you didn't want them to be stolen or attacked by other predators or whatever, so you brought them in. And so everybody is one big happy family. Imagine the smell. But it's dirt floors, right? So at least you can clean it up easily. But this is the way the poor lived. But they still had the living space as opposed to the dirt floor space. Now, if there was a wealthier family, then they had multiple floors. You would typically walk in, and there would be a courtyard, an open-air courtyard. And then there would be a space for cooking, and then there would be a space for the animals. And on the second floor, that was your shirah. That was the living space. That's where the sleeping quarters were. That's where the eating space was. So think about the upper room that Jesus and his disciples rent when they are in town in Jerusalem to have their meals. They're renting somebody's shirah. They're renting somebody's living space in order to have what they need to do. Mark 14 talks about that upper room. And so what was typically happening here, what must have been happening, is that Joseph with Mary go to Bethlehem, which is the house of his lineage, and they were basically going to be staying with relatives, or they're going to be staying with friends, or going to be staying with someone that they knew, because everyone was kind of related back then, especially if you're going back to the house of your ancestors. So probably staying with relatives or friends. And the house was so full that the living space area was packed out. They couldn't fit. And so they were relegated to the first floor. It was probably a wealthier house that had multiple floors. They were relegated to the first floor because there was no room in the shirah. There was no room in the living space. And so all of these details are depicting a normal Hebrew birth for the time, for a poor family. It's unremarkable. And it went unnoticed, pretty much. At least certainly by the relatives. They didn't make room for them in the living space. They didn't see anything necessary for them to make room for them, and so they put them with the animals. And then, what about those shepherds, though? And what about the Magi? They certainly had a completely different reaction. Let's take a look at Matthew 2, where he talks about the visit of the Magi, starting right at verse 1. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea. So this takes place after the birth has already happened. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king. So at least that locks us in. So if we're going to have a date for Jesus' birth, we know it's not going to be 0, as we have postulated it in the West, because Herod died in 4 BC. So we know that if this is in the days of Herod, it has to be prior to 4 BC. Most scholars now place Jesus' date of birth at somewhere between 6 and 4 BC. So in the days of Herod, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem. Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him. And when Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Gathering together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born, he Herod. And they said to him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for this is what has been written by the prophet. And you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are by no means least among the leaders of Judah. For out of you shall come forth a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Then Herod secretly called the Magi and determined from them the exact time the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search carefully for the child. And when you have found him, report to me, so that I too may come and worship him. Yeah, right. After hearing the king, they went their way. And the star which they had seen in the east went on before them until it came and stood over the place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly and with great joy. Now, those details about the star defy any kind of star known to humankind. And in another message, I talk about what those details mean if you look at it from an astrological point of view. And astrology may be blowing your mind right now, but in the ancient world, astronomy and astrology were one and the same. And they didn't have the horoscope aspects now, but they were used for signs and for seasons, just as Genesis tells us. And those details line up exactly with the way an astronomer would talk about certain aspects that were happening then. But that's another story, and we're not going there today. After coming into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell to the ground and worshipped him. Then opening their treasures, they presented to him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned by God in a dream not to return to Herod, the Magi left for their own country by another way. And in another message, we've talked about all of the symbolism of gold and frankincense and myrrh. Every one of these details is filled with symbolism, filled with meaning, and filled with purpose. But for our purposes here today, just look at the face of that story. Wow. These are dramatic events, right? But for all the reaction that the Magi had, and for all the reaction that the shepherds had, what about Mary and Joseph's relatives? What about them? What about their friends or whoever they were sharing this home with? What's up with them? There's nothing recorded about them, nothing recorded about their reactions. But the one thing that we do know is they didn't make room for them in the Shirah, for the birth. It was just kind of a first come, first serve sort of thing. Why not? They saw nothing special in the birth, and yet the Magi traveled 1,000 miles to get there. And the shepherd were greeted by angelic beings and told where to go, and all of them fell in worship at his feet. They didn't even make room for him in the living space. They saw nothing special about his birth, saw nothing special in him or in Mary or in Joseph or in any of this. Jesus tells us that a prophet has no honor in his hometown. Well, apparently he has no honor with his relatives either, or even with the household. But why did the relatives, why did the friends see nothing special here? Obviously, Herod saw nothing special except a threat. That's all he saw. But he saw nothing spiritual, nothing life-transforming. And yet the shepherds and the Magi saw so much. Now, you've all heard the saying that seeing is believing, right? But the truth is, eyewitnesses are pretty bad. I've heard statistics that up to 73% of eyewitness testimony is faulty. You know, we can all see the same thing and then believe different things about it or understand different things about it, right? Seeing is believing, sort of. But there was an English poet who said that some things must be believed before they can be seen. I want to talk about confirmation bias. Often what we see is only going to confirm what we already think we know, what we already believe. That's what confirmation bias is. So much of that is the way that we process information. If we are not open to something coming to us from a completely different place with a completely different message and a radically different truth, it's just going to end up confirming what we think we already know. It's what we do as people. Until we are ready to release that bias, First of all, see it for what it is in us and release it. Let go of the core beliefs that we don't even know are operating in the unconscious, which means we have to do the work to bring them up into the conscious so we can start to let them go. In other words, if we can't get back to beginner's mind that we talked about a few weeks ago, get back to someone who sees something as if for the first time, if we can't start to grow small again, get off our high horse, get off whatever our education or experience has built for us as a perch, and get back down to the beginning. If we can't do that, we're never going to really be able to see the significance of things, because we're only going to see what we are prepared to see. Always, in anything that we do, we're only going to be able to see what we're prepared to see. The rest is not going to compute. We need to purge. We need to strip away. We need to lower our perspective, become a teachable beginner again, if we're going to be prepared to see something completely different. And so the question is, what are you prepared to see? What am I prepared to see? What are any of us prepared to see? Now, your profession is going to prepare you to see certain things. What has your profession taught you to be? If you're an artist, then you're going to see things that others miss about every portrait or every sculpture or wherever the art is that you are trained. If you're in woodworking, you can walk into a kitchen and you're going to see those cabinets completely differently than someone who just walks in and notices the color or the latches, right? What are you prepared to see? If you're in sports, if you know sports and you're going to watch a game and you're going to see things that everybody else misses. When we go to lunch over here and the guys who are really into sports, man, they're watching the games and they're seeing all this stuff and it's just like, oh, okay. Maybe you're prepared to see a person in a way that nobody else sees. Other people are saying, what do you see in that guy? But you do see something because you're prepared to see, because you gave them enough time. You suspended any of your disbelief long enough to find out what was in there, what was in the core. So this is what we're talking about. Whether you're trained as you were as a beginner, whether you are prepared for something, that's going to be the measure of what you can see that others will miss. That will be the measure of what you can value that others don't. And so what do we see in Jesus? What do we really see in Jesus? Well, I can tell you that as a kid growing up Catholic, I would love the baby Jesus. I just loved the baby Jesus because he was so relatable as a kid. You know, I could connect with that. And the bleeding man on the cross, not so much. And if you're a Catholic, you know there is a bleeding man on the cross, not like here in Protestant where we've taken the corpus off. And if you ever walk into a Latino church, then you really see the whole graphic details because they spared no expense, you know, in the bleeding man on the cross. Now, later as I was taught within my faith as Catholicism, I came to understand why I was supposed to love the bleeding man on the cross. But it was all intellectual. It kept Jesus at a distance. As I got older and I got busy, well, then I fell out of love with Jesus entirely because he just didn't seem relevant anymore. I no longer saw him at all in the buzz of my life and everything that I was trying to make happen under my own steam, right? And I didn't relate. And I didn't need him, I thought. I could push all this through myself. I can make this all happen myself. And then I got mugged by life. We all get mugged by life eventually, right? And everything that I thought I knew suddenly was suspect. Everything I thought I knew was called into question. I had all the wind knocked out of me. I felt completely hollowed out. And suddenly, guess what? Jesus was relevant again because I needed saving. And I was starting to realize that I was powerless to do it on my own. I needed saving. But still my head got in the way. What I thought I knew about Jesus was still keeping him at arm's length. What I thought I knew about Jesus was not helpful at all to my situation. In fact, it kept pushing me further and further out and further down. I still needed to get more hollowed out. As hollowed out as the life circumstance had taken me. There was more that I needed to do intentionally, consciously, to be emptied out enough, to be willing to let go of Jesus completely as I knew him, as I thought I knew him. I like to say that I had to be willing to leave Jesus in order to find him and see him again for the first time. I had to get all of that stuff out of the way. I had to return to my own beginner's mind. I had to return to the state of the child. I had to grow small enough that I could see the baby Jesus again and the bleeding man on the cross, to see the significance of both and realize that it was one and the same message, not two different messages and two different experiences, but one and the same. All the details that we get of Jesus' life are pointing to a person who lived on the margins of life. Jesus was never in the center. Jesus was never in that power position. He was always on the margins. He was poor, but grateful, right? He was vulnerable. He was unassuming. He was wholly dependent on God. He says that over and over again. I do nothing of my own accord, nothing of my own initiative. I only do what God does through me. I and the Father are one, wholly dependent on God. He's childlike. He loves children. He loves to play with children. He doesn't worry about dignity. He gets down in the dust and plays with the kids. In other words, he was anavim. And we've talked about this Hebrew word before, anavim. It's a Hebrew ideal of the person who is closest to God. When Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for they will inherit the kingdom," what he's talking about there, poor in spirit, messes with our heads because we think it's someone who does not have any kind of spiritual valence to them. But it's an idiomatic phrase. And what it means is an attitude of poverty, even if you're rich. It means all the things we just talked about. Poor, but grateful. Vulnerable, unassuming, wholly dependent on God. All of that awareness of your own powerlessness. And poor doesn't mean physically poor, materially poor. You can be rich and still be anavim. You can be poor and not anavim at all because it's an interior attitude of the heart. And so it was this philosophical and spiritual and religious ideal of the Hebrews, but culturally, the anavim were still not honored. They were marginalized. They were reviled. They were ignored because they were poor. Some of them couldn't afford to do the things that the law required. Even though the ideal was there, the reality was not. But God and Jesus honored them. Absolutely. Not only did Jesus honor the anavim, he said, this is the only way to the kingdom. This is the only way back to the Father through this attitude of poverty, even if you're rich. When he said that a camel can go through the eye of a needle before a rich man can get into kingdom, what he's talking about there is those who are rich, those who are endowed. But more than that, those who identify with their riches, those who identify with their talents, those who identify with whatever they have that creates an advantage for them in life, they're not going to be able to see the value, to see the significance of baby Jesus. This poor, marginalized, unremarkable infant, not going to be able to see it if you're identified with all of this other. Mary and Joseph were anavim, poor but grateful, poor but dedicated and dependent on God. The shepherds were anavim, poor, right? But they had that shepherd consciousness. They had spent most of their lives in silence on the hillside with their animals, and they had developed this kind of second sight. Poor, but anavim. But apparently, Joseph and Mary's relatives, friends that were in that house, were not anavim. We don't know their status. We don't know whether they were poor or wealthy. But it's not about material wealth, as we said. Even if they were poor themselves, they were not prepared in their hearts to see what was right in front of them. Could you imagine having the Holy Family in your home ready to give birth, and you won't give them a space in your living area? Wow. Now, that would be different these days than those, right? Because births were handled differently, but still, they weren't prepared to see. And this is the genius of the Magi. This is why we need to take a look at the Magi, because they were rich. They were powerful. They were Babylonian or Persian priests, magistrates, astronomers, astrologers, astronomers, and advisors to the king, just like Daniel is described in the Old Testament as an advisor to the king because of his abilities and what he could see. That was valuable to someone who's trying to run an empire, right? In fact, it's quite possible that these Magi were descendants, Jewish descendants of David and his family, because not all the Jews came back when they were allowed to come back after the exile. Only about a small percentage of them actually came back. The rest were already, it had been 3 generations in Babylon. They were doing well. They didn't want to leave and go back to some devastated area and try to rebuild. It was all the pioneers among them who did that. Most of the Jews stayed. And so whoever was advising the king in this Jewish tradition, most likely these were the ones who had been waiting century after century for the return of their king, scouring the skies and waiting for the right combination to appear so that they knew. But even though they were rich and even though they were powerful, even though they had status and all this education, they still were humble. They still remained vulnerable, dependent, and childlike to be able to do what they did. They were willing to risk being wrong. Do you know how hard that is for most of us? To risk being wrong, to risk being proven wrong, to admit that you're wrong. They were willing to look ridiculous, to stake so much on this crazy trip that made no sense, to put themselves into harm's way. They had to cross the Parthian frontier between Rome and Parthia in their journeys. This was not an easy journey for them to do, but they were on Avim. And it allowed them to be able to see life this way, allowed them to be able to process this way. And why is it important for us to pay attention to what's going on in these details? Because the Magi are the closest model in all of the Christmas story, all the characters in the Christmas story. The Magi are the closest model for us to relate to. Because guess what? We are rich also. We are educated also. By the world's standards, we're in the top couple percentiles. May not think of ourselves as rich compared to everything else. It's relative. But we are rich and we are educated as well. And so if we're going to be able to do what the Magi did, what Joseph and Mary were able to do, what the shepherds were able to do, then we're going to need to get prepared as well. Only those prepared, whether they're rich or poor, could see the significance of this Anavim child and the man that he became. 1,200 years later, in the midst of a wealthy life, in the midst of a wealthy church at that time, Francis of Assisi hollowed out. Series of events in his life, going to war and being captured as a prisoner of war and becoming deathly ill. A lot of things hollowed him out and gave him a different perspective. He got mugged by life, in other words, right? And he found his Anavim heart through that process. He renounced his family's wealth and lived voluntarily in physical poverty. He lived as a vagrant. And he started to work to reform the church's ideals. He heard God tell him to rebuild my church. He thought literally he was supposed to rebuild the falling down church at San Damiano, but really he understood later on. No, he was supposed to, from the inside out, start to reform the ideals the church had lost as it became a part of Roman power, as it grew so wealthy and lost everything in its connection with the baby Jesus, right? With the Anavim spirit. And he wanted to immerse himself in the experience that the Magi had. And so in 1223, he asked for permission from the Pope and got it to create the first nativity scene. So that nativity scene and every nativity scene you see, you can thank Francis of Assisi for, because he was the first one to do it in a little village called Greccio. It was actually a nativity play, if you think about it. It was a nativity service because it was full-sized. It was a full-size stable, full-sized manger. There were live animals, the oxen and the donkeys and whatever we had. It was all live animals. And I want to read you an account of that evening, of the first nativity scene, from Thomas of Solano, who was a follower of Francis of Assisi and a friend, and eventually a part of his order, the OFM, the Orders of Friars Minor. He was also an eyewitness. So yeah, we've heard about eyewitnesses now, so take that into account. But this is what he wrote. Francis would recall Christ's words through persistent meditation and bring to mind his deeds through the most penetrating consideration. The humility of the incarnation and the charity of the passion occupied his memory particularly, to the extent that he wanted to think of hardly anything else. You know, the humility of the incarnation, that's an interesting phrase. It is humility to move into this lower state. He had to empty himself out, Paul says, the kenosis, in order to become human as we are. So this humility of the incarnation is something that Francis really latched onto. The charity of the passion is all he wanted to think about. The day of Christmas drew near. The time of great rejoicing came. The brothers were called from their various places. Men and women of that neighborhood prepared with glad hearts according to their means, candles and torches to light up that night. The manger was prepared. The hay had been brought. The ox and ass were led in. There, simplicity was honored. Poverty was exalted. Humility was commended. And Greccio was made, as it were, a new Bethlehem. The night was lighted up like the day, and it delighted men and beasts. The people came and were filled with new joy over the mystery. The woods rang with the voices of the crowd, and the rocks made answer to their jubilation. The brothers sang, paying their debt of praise to the Lord, and the whole night resounded with their rejoicing. And when Francis came, finding all things prepared, he saw it and was glad. He is dressed in the vestments of the deacon, and with full voice sings the holy gospel, a powerful voice, a pleasant voice, a clear voice, a musical voice, inviting all to the highest of gifts. Then he preaches to the people standing around him, and pours forth sweet honey about the birth of the poor king and the poor city of Bethlehem. Moreover, burning with excessive love, he often calls Christ the babe from Bethlehem, saying the word Bethlehem in the manner of a bleating sheep. Bethlehem. You got to picture that, right? It's so great. Francis is so wonderful. He used to stand on his head so he felt that he could see the world rightly. He called himself the jongleur de Dieu, which means God's clown, God's juggler, whatever. This is Francis. Think about that. Childlike, voluntary poverty. He wore the vestments of the deacon because even though he was offered the priesthood, he refused it. He didn't think he was worthy of the priesthood. He stayed a deacon his entire life. This is who we're talking about here. Who do you think Jesus was like? It's the same. That he would play with kids in the dirt in the streets. We have to see this. He fills his mouth with sound, but even more with sweet affection. He seems to lick his lips whenever he uses the expressions Jesus or babe from Bethlehem, tasting the word on his palate and savoring the sweetness of the word. Francis stands before the manger, filled with heartfelt sighs and overcome with wondrous joy. Don't you love all those intimate and beautiful details? Licking his lips, it takes you there, doesn't it? And it paints a picture of Francis, a man in complete immersion, completely present, immersed in everything, the sights, the smells, the feel, the taste, everything, as a reflection of God's love, especially in the playfulness, especially in the humor and the humility, all of that in-loveness that he expressed with his whole being as he was part of this. He was lost in a sensory overload, right? Ever been there? It just blows your mind after a while. The power of the moment. He was brought to tears recognizing Jesus. Now, we get no such detail of the Magi and their experience as they approached. But can you imagine their reaction as the same? After centuries of waiting in their tradition, after the journey that they took, after all of the uncertainty and wondering and peril, to actually be standing there and know who you were standing with, what would their reaction have been? And how about us? What's our reaction? Can we recognize Jesus as he appears in our lives? Not as we expect him to be, not as it's pictured here in Scripture, but as Jesus actually appears to us. Unassuming, in a shape or a form that we would never expect. Can we do that? I wanted to read a little bit more. This is from a nun in the Franciscan order. And she writes, "The story of the incarnation is really our story. It is the exact meeting point of God and human beings. We so often think of God as some kind of remote power or superhuman energy that has somehow set this whole creation thing going and then stepped back to see what would happen. It's impossible for God to step back from anything God has chosen to be involved with. At the very first moment of creation, God freely decided to get involved with you and me and with all created being. Absolutely everything God does with free, unconditional, absolute, and irrevocable love. This is very hard for us to understand and accept because we of ourselves do not naturally love this way. Yet every Christmas, we celebrate that God came among us as one of us so we could love like God and be like God and share God's own life forever. This is what Emmanuel means. God with us. Francis of Assisi was profoundly moved as he contemplated God's coming among us as a human being in Jesus Christ. This reality filled him with awe. He understood that we human beings are essentially poor, that of ourselves we actually are nothing. Everything we are and have has been given to us by God in love. We are totally dependent on the God who lovingly and freely created us and who holds us in being. When Francis talked about poverty, this is what he was talking about. The recognition of what we are before God. When he thought about this little newborn baby lying in utterly poor circumstances, son of an equally poor mother, it moved Francis to tears. That this little human being could be a full manifestation of the God of all creation astounded him and wakened in him the most ardent and grateful love. It made him want to laugh and sing and shout and weep, so that is exactly what he did. Francis was a man who really expressed his emotions. For him, the Gospels came alive and were made present in highly charged dramatic action. Word and deed were as one. To know the story was to become a participant in it, to play a role in it, to live it in such a way that its power became irresistible to others. So it's kind of a chicken and egg thing if you think about it. The Father's love changes us, but we need to be changed enough in order to see it, to recognize it for what it is. Or at least we need to be willing to be immersed, as Francis was, as the Magi were. Willing to be wrong, willing to look ridiculous, willing to admit the limits of our knowledge and our power, to suspend what we think we know, to let go of the illusion of our power and our security so that we can start to experience something that comes from a completely different place. And so we must be enough like God, Anavim, in order to see and to recognize him in everyone and everything around us, and especially from where we don't expect. Kind of takes one to know one. In other words, we got to get close enough that we're looking in the right spot. Like when a child loses something and you want to find it, what do you have to do? You got to get down in your hands and knees and see all the hiding places that you don't see from 6 feet off the ground. You see it from 3 feet off the ground. That's where we're going to find our God, in those kind of nooks and crannies. And the common traits between Mary and Joseph and the shepherds and the Magi and Francis, who could all do this, is humility, childlike purity of heart, a willingness to set off without an actual destination, without any guarantee of success, following real-time directions, recalculating that you hear from your GPS. Are you willing to just set off and see what happens in faith, in trust, with that ability to immerse yourself in the relationships that are present to you right now and live with absolute abandon? This is what the gospel is really all about. And if you think about it, we trying to do this here and now, we are the Magi, if we're willing to be. And the Magi are us. They are the model. They're the metaphor for anyone who is struggling to see life through the eye of a needle. This is who we are. The Magi prepared their entire lives, set out to find a king, a priest, a prophet, and what they found was a poor, speechless child. The promise of their star was still unformed, unrecognizable to them. But their Anavim hearts were prepared enough to see past their expectations, to surrender, to trust. We set out to find our God, but have we prepared ourselves? Can we see the sacred in the smallest details of life, or are we always looking at the top of steeples? Because if not, if we haven't been prepared, we're going to miss God in this unformed child, this Christmas child. And we're going to continue to rage against the unformed answers, the non-answers that we get, against the uncertainty that we constantly feel in our questioning. Christmas is the promise of our star, while it's still unformed in us. Christmas is the promise of our star, while it's still unformed in us. We need to be prepared. We need to be anavim enough to actually see. The star is calling us right now. It's there, just as the Magi saw it. And it's promising us Emmanuel. It's promising us God with us right here, right now. A life that's lived in that kind of presence, in that kind of connection. And whether we're formed or ready or not, the star continues to call. But we will only answer when we start to see it as such. When we can start to see that our God is an unassuming God, a humble God, a vulnerable God. Anavim. Are we prepared for that? That flies in the face of everything that we thought we knew. But we will never see God in our moments. We will never see Emmanuel in our midst until we're enough like God to value the smallness of things rather than the spectacular constantly. It's getting to be many moons ago, many Christmases ago, that I had this experience, but I wrote a small journal entry about it, and it seems relevant right now. A week before Christmas, waiting at a stoplight in darkness in December, I have a front row seat at the crosswalk. Through the passenger window, I catch what must be a father and daughter beginning their walk across the intersection, moving very slowly. I wonder if they'll get across in time. Both carry cardboard coffee cups in their right hands, but while his free arm swings with each step, I notice hers held stiffly, bent against her side. She appears 11 or 12 years old as I collect details. Left hand curled cruelly back at the wrist, left foot turned sharply inward, and the limping shuffle it creates, thick glasses and puffy features. It dawns why they move so slowly across my glass screen. Father matches her pace with practiced grace, unhurried, vaguely protective, but not hovering either. They went to Starbucks. He bought her coffee, or more likely hot chocolate, amid all those lights and decorations in the store. I wondered how it all appeared to her through those thick glasses, how she must have smiled looking around, up at him, back around. I wondered how it all appeared to him, being forced to walk so slowly to match that shuffling pace for 11 or 12 years, for the rest of her life, or the rest of his. Perhaps to learn to see life as his daughter saw it, would always see it. When he realized he couldn't change her, had she changed him? The hot chocolate and the unhurried, unself-conscious walk in front of all those windshield implied so much. Christmas has a way of bringing vague, submerged feelings to the surface the way hook and line bring up fish. We find ourselves suddenly grasping, squirming emotions that should have nothing to do with Christmas, with what we think Christmas is supposed to mean, what we remember it used to mean. You see, we imprint the meaning of Christmas through a child's eyes, and then subtly mourn its loss each year through adult eyes. Christmas hasn't changed. The possibility of Christmas returns every December. We have changed. We've lost the pace of childhood. I'm thinking maybe Christmas as remembered happens exactly when we stop trying to make it happen, when we stop running faster and faster, trying to catch the stored experience of Christmas. Maybe meaning finally has a chance to catch up and catch us. I can't choose the pace of life around me any more than I can alter the course of a storm. But maybe I can choose my own pace within it. Maybe I can allow myself to shuffle slowly through the crosswalk with a warm cardboard cup in my hand and the sense of a patient father at my side. You see, I have a Father who can see past the unformed promise in me. I have a Father who can see the potential in me, recognize my beauty in spite of myself, teaching me with unfailing love to try to do the same, to see the same everywhere I look, in everyone I see. And so do you. You have the same Father. And of course we will always find our God as a child. Of course we will. Unformed and always still forming. Why expect any other form? That's who our God is. Every time we meet our God is Christmas morning. The babe is in the manger. The star is in the east. And we are the Magi. And the infant, and they are us. Let's pray. Father, this Christmas, help us to be more prepared. Not for the things we usually prepare for, but to see the significant in the insignificant. To read between the lines, to hear between the lines, to value the most mundane things, even in the midst of all our preparation. In our gatherings, help us to just see the nature of the connection between us, our friends, our relatives. In between the presents, help us to just see the gratitude for just another breath. Help us to be prepared for the smallest of things so that when you present to us in our daily lives as Emmanuel, just being with us, that we will see you and not just leap over looking for you. You are always here. You are always presenting in the most subtle ways. That's the Christmas we want to have. That's the gift we want to accept. So help us, Lord, to be prepared for just that. You hold nothing back. You never withhold a thing. It's already here, and it always has been. Help us to see what we've already been given so we can unwrap and get on with it. Thank you, Father, for being exactly who you are. And never let us forget, we can only love because you loved us first. In Jesus' name, amen. Let's all stand.